God created an existence, and within that existence, for man to be able to not only survive, which means to maintain himself, but even to advance and to address many objectives that he's meant to address, those opportunities avail themselves if the person takes advantage of those opportunities. Person has to recognize many things. You know, it's interesting, you meet with people over years, and there's one flaw which many people possess within their emotional makeup. And because of that, it leads to many things which are not good. Sometimes it motivates a person, but it emanates from not a good place. It's called self-esteem. If a person is failing from self-esteem, he doesn't believe that whether he's worthy or he has the capability, and he doesn't have the confidence. So it could manifest itself in two ways. Either it manifests itself because the person doesn't appreciate who he is, or he doesn't believe that he's capable of bringing about certain results. So he coasts throughout life, and he always remains way below his potential because he doesn't believe that he has the capability to advance and rise to his potential, or because he has a self-esteem problem. He always has to prove to himself that he is despite what he believes he's not. And that usually leads to a superiority complex. It can either manifest itself in an inferiority complex or in a superiority complex. I always say people only behave in a superior manner because people are intimidated by that person who displays the superiority. But if a person would be ignored and would be dismissed despite his saber rate rattling, he would just go away. He would just wither and disappear. Person comes over to me, says, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "Who are you?" "Do you know what I'm worth?" I said, "It's irrelevant to me what you're worth." "Do you know who I know?" It's also irrelevant. So he's pulled out every ace in the hole, and you know where he ends up? He ends up in the hole. Because whatever he says he is, to me, it's irrelevant. So here he's trying to impress upon me who he is, what his accomplishment is. What relevance does it have to me? You want to put yourself in a position where I should believe you're superior to who I am. Why are you superior? I'm superior to what you are. Or it's irrelevant whether I am or not. I am who I am. That's who I am. That person has a problem. Because immediately I've undercut him from his high horse. You know, when a person climbs on a high horse, he's only higher because he's on top of the horse. The horse wouldn't be there. He'd be no higher than I am, or maybe even shorter than I am. So it's only everything is in a person's mind where he wants to put himself because of whatever may be. A person who's confident in who he is, I don't have to tell you who I am. I only have to tell you who I am if I want to accomplish something. I want to achieve something. Therefore, you have to know who I am. But if I have no relevance to you, I don't have to impress myself upon you who I am because it's not relevant, or who you are. So everything emanates from one's self-perception. How do you perceive yourself in terms of who you are? Now, as a Jew, who are we? We're reading now the redemption, the exodus of Egypt, how we were taken out of Egypt to be taken as God's chosen people. And God gave us something which is nothing the equivalent of that. as King Solomon says in Mishlei, Ki lekach tov nosat lochem. I've given you the best commodity. There's no commodity which is innately as valuable as what I've given you. So what the Jew possesses, nobody possesses. And this is not based on my evaluation. This is God's evaluation. He tells you there's nothing was the equivalent of this. And this is what happened at Sinai, going back almost 4,000 years ago, when every Jew heard God openly speaking to every one of us. That's where our tradition is rooted upon. It's rooted upon fact, irrefutable fact. That's where every Jew is coming from. The issue is, or the problem is, he questions that. But if a Jew would not question where it all began, and it's a continuum until the end of time, a Jew would not have a problem in understanding who he is and what the value of that is. Moshe says in the name of God, who are we as Jews? You are God's children. You say, well, all mankind are God's children. No. God says, no, only the Jewish people are my children. All mankind are my creations. They're all my subjects. But my children, I only have one family. Jewish people are my children. Not only that, when God sends Moshe as his representative to redeem the Jewish people, what does he say to Paro? B'ni b'chori Yisrael. My son, my firstborn, the Jewish people. Let them out. Let my people go. Who are the Jewish people to me? The equivalent of my firstborn. So it's not just an ordinary child. It's the most special child. If we factually would internalize that reality and believe that reality, we'd understand our Father is always accessible to us. A person has a special relationship with the Father, and the Father loves that child more than anything in the world. Of course, it's his firstborn. And God has displayed that reality to his son. He's not a stranger to his son. Whenever he walks into the room, what does the father normally say to the child? He's interested in his welfare. He'll ask him questions, but every question is only because he's interested in the welfare of the child. Except we say during the 10 days of penitence or on a fast day, there's a supplication, there's a prayer. It's called Avinu Malkeinu. We refer to God as our Father, our King. Avinu Malkeinu. One of the blessings of the Amidah, the blessing of tshuva, of repentance, is both references are referred to in that blessing. Hashivenu Avinu l'sorosecho. Father, our Father, bring us back to your Torah. The Karvenu Malkeinu l'avodosecho. And our King, bring us back to your service. So there's a dual relationship here. Even a person may be a prince, and the king loves the prince as a child, and the prince is the child of the king, but it's a dual relationship. The son, who's the prince, still has to deal with the father as the king. There has to be a degree of reverence. So we have this duality of a relationship. Avinu, that is the essence of who we are. But in addition to Avinu, it's Malkeinu. He's our king. That's a reality. So if we understand the creator of existence, who took us as his people and gave us which was most precious to him, which is the Torah, which is the ultimate commodity. Ki lechech tov nosati lochem. You understand that. we're not going to abandon it. And we're always going to keep it as a priority. It will always be within our focus. You know, a person has a $100 million line of credit, and he knows he can always call on that line of credit, always use it. And when you use that line of credit, you can do tremendous things with it. The return is phenomenal. And the interest payment is minimal, or maybe no, not even an interest payment. If you pay back soon enough, it may be waived. If the lender sees that you're using it for things that he values. A Jew has an unlimited line of credit with God, as a child has with a parent, as long as the child behaves properly and responsibly and is in sync with what the father wants for the child. And one doesn't abuse the privileges which a father provides for the child. You abuse it, it's just time. It just come a moment, you can be cut off until you learn your lesson to have it reinstated. That is the reality of our relationship. So firstly, when we speak about having the opportunity to have an audience with God, the King of Kings, one of a kind of audience. First, we have to understand who he is, who we are versus him. And not only is who are we versus him, what is the nature of the relationship? We have to enter that relationship, enter that audience with the ultimate level of reverence, a level of humility, because who he is, who we are, it's a reality with less than a speck in his presence. He's our father, he's our king. He is the creator. He is the master. But despite that, we are his child. He's our Avinu. And we know that. It's not enough to know it verbally. It's to internalize that reality. You know, there's an expression, don't do as I say, do as I do. We find the Gemara tells us whenever there was an issue, there was a drought, there was a special Jew. His name was Choni HaMagil. Choni HaMagil, the reason his name was Choni, and he was called HaMagil because whenever he would supplicate Hashem on behalf of the Jewish people, he would create a circular depression, and he would stand in that depression, and he would raise his eyes to Hashem and says, your children need rain. It hasn't rained in a while. And I take an oath, I will not leave this encircled area until you provide rain for your children. This is what he speaks to God. And it hasn't rained for an extended period of time. Serious drought. It's a question, if it doesn't rain, there won't be what to eat. And as soon as he says this, it starts drizzling. So Choni says to God, we're not getting anywhere with a few droplets of water. We need serious rain. It hasn't rained in an extended period of time. All of a sudden, it comes down in torrents. Choni says to God, I didn't ask you to drown us out. We want rain's a blessing. This is a deluge. We're being drowned here. It started to rain as it should have, until all the water systems were filled, until the water rose to a level that the Talmud says in Yerushalayim there was a stone where people would announce lost articles. The water rose to that level of the stone. And after Choni finishes praying, the leading Torah sage of the generation His name was Shimon Meshetach, sends a message to Choni. Choni, factually, you deserve to be excommunicated. Because the way you spoke to God, totally inappropriate. It's the ultimate lack of respect. You give God ultimatums. You will not leave that circle and you take an oath unless he delivers. And in the interchange, when it wasn't to your liking, you say, God, I don't want this, I don't want that. You're dictating to God. But the reason why I will not excommunicate you, because you're like a child speaking to a father. A child speaks to a father differently than a stranger speaks to another individual. A child doesn't have to speak at the same level of respect because the father wants to do for the child. Therefore, you being different than everyone else, a third party would have been excommunicated because of a level of disrespect, the way you expressed yourself. But because of the nature of your relation with God, it's like a child to a father. And he loves you like that child. Now, why was Choni able to bring about such immediate results with just a few requests? He didn't say that either. How did Choni live his life? He lived his life as a child who loves his father. And there was nothing no area, no level of dedication that Choni did not deliver to show that love for his father. When the child appreciates the way the father loves him, the father responds with that same level of love. And it was known, he was renowned for this reality. Therefore, Shimon ben Shetach says, you're different than most people. Choni understood who he was. He understood the nature of the relationship. He understood the father could provide and will provide if you meet the grade, if you meet the prerequisites. There was a great Jew. He's mentioned in the Talmud multiple times. His name is Reb Chanina ben Dosa. Chanina ben Dosa was such a special Jew that every day there's a heavenly voice that comes out from Sinai that announces to the world that the whole world is sustained in the merit of Chanina ben Dosa. That's how special he was. And it was, his level of subsistence was literally a small measure of carob from one Shabbos, Erev Shabbos to another Erev Shabbos. And it was sufficient, no complaints. It didn't in any way detract from his love for Hashem. And whenever he would pray for people, they would always recover. If he would pray for them, and he would have a sense if they would recover or not recover. Rabbi Gamliel, who was the prince of the Jewish people, he had a son that was deathly ill. He was the leading Torah sage. He was the prince. Son was deathly ill. And he sends a message to Choni, to Reb Chanina ben Dosa, to pray on behalf of his son. So his wife, the prince's wife, Ramil's wife, says to him, you're the leading Torah sage. You qualified to be the greatest Torah sage of the nation in a leadership position. You're special. Why did you pray for your own son? What do you have to request Reb Chanina ben Dosa to pray for your son? He says to his wife, you don't understand the difference between me and him. He says, my status and the nature of my relation with God is, I am like a prince. I am like a minister at the court of a king. A minister comes to the court of the king when he's called. He doesn't have access to the inner chambers of the king. That's who I am. I am a minister. The nature of my relationship is not quite the same as a person who's a chambermaid. A chambermaid goes into the inner sanctums of the king, even to his private quarters, because the chambermaid has no value, has no identity. The chambermaid, it's not considered a violation of privacy because she has no value, no identity. Reb Chanina ben Dosa, as a person, his identity was God. He was negated to God to such a degree, his going into that area, into the inner sanctums, he wasn't trespassing because he himself was synonymous with God's servant to the nth degree. Therefore, he's able to enter and make requests, which I can't make. This is what Rabbi Gamliel explained to his wife. Therefore, his supplication is a different level of supplication. He's able to draw from areas which I can't draw from. But you realize, every Jew in his DNA has the same DNA as Reb Chanina ben Dosa, as Reb Gamliel, and as Chonei Amagil. All our DNA is the same DNA. The question is, God's given endowment, how do we utilize it? How do we invest it? How do we actualize it? How do we implement it? Do we do it for the sake of God? Do we do it with humility? Do we do it with reverence? We're able to display it and interact and represent ourselves as independent players or only as God's agents. There's an expression in the Talmud, when a person appoints, when the Kohen officiates on behalf of the non-Kohen to bring a sacrifice, is the Kohen shluch didan in Aramaic? Is he the agent of the one who's bringing the sacrifice, or is he shluch de Rachmana, or he's God's agent? A person who functions as God's agent, what is the value of the agent? The value of the agent is the one he represents. If you're an independent contractor, you represent yourself. And you're acting on behalf of yourself for someone else. A person who is the agent of whoever may be, his power is only because of who he represents, and he recognizes that. That's shluch de Rachmana. You're God's agent. Every Jew has that special pedigree. Knowing that reality, that the nature of the relationship is Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. There's a duality in that relationship. But first and foremost, it's Avinu. That's the first reference. Because we are Bona Atem Lashem Elokechem. At what level is our Father? B'ni B'chori Yisrael. Moshe says to Pharaoh, B'ni B'chori, my son, my firstborn Israel. That's the value, to what degree God values the Jewish people. As if with his only child. Every Jew is as if he's his only child. But of course, we have to toe the line. To be worthy. No, it's interesting. The Talmud says, Yisrael api shechoto Yisraelu. A Jew, God forbid, even if he becomes an apostate, he cannot abdicate the throne. A Jew cannot abdicate the throne. A Jew is a Jew, regardless of what his beliefs are, regardless of what his behavior is. It's something you can't terminate. You can't change the fabric of your essence. At Sinai, we were taken as a Jewish people. We're forever that. If we fail, there are consequences. There's serious liability. If we succeed, the upside is unlimited. We're speaking, but it's not enough to discuss it and know it. You have to internalize it, to have a sense of understanding who we are, what is our reality. Who am I to ask? There's no self-esteem issue. With the smallest number of people in existence, What could be our value? When Avram Avinu had to go to war against the four mightiest powers, he was one man against the world. He had no problem with the odds. How could he be victorious? Avram understood who he was and who his backer was. When God's your backer, you fear nothing. And Avram knew that. Therefore, he took on the four mightiest powers single-handedly and defeated them. And he was proclaimed by the world as the Si Elokim. You are the Prince of God. At that moment. A person is a professional deal maker, and he's succeeded many times in the past making those deals. When he goes in to negotiate that deal and he sees the deal is that special deal, immediately he rises to the challenge and he enters into the negotiation like a first-class professional because he knows, he appreciates the reality of the deal and he understands his own capacity. So he gives it his best because he knows what the outcome will be. It's a phenomenal acquisition. What is the value of having an audience with God and making a request? You have to appreciate the deal. It's real. Your request is, God is attentive to it. God listens to it. God values it. But you got to negotiate the deal. You have to come prepared. You have to come with the right mindset, with a level of humility. You have to meet certain criteria. But if you believe that reality, then you will succeed. But if you don't believe that reality, you question the viability of the deal to a point that's almost insulting to the one who puts out the opportunity. Do you think you're going to succeed? The man is not going to give it to you because you're questioning the veracity of the reality of whatever is being presented. And you stand before God and you make a request and it's questionable in your mind whether he will deliver, not because of your lack of worthiness, because, I'm just going through emotions. It's almost like play acting. This is the real thing. It's almost insulting. It's literally a disrespect. So firstly, we have to understand who we are. And if we understand who we are and what we're capable of accomplishing, then maybe if you have a degree of sense, good sense, you're going to try to maximize on taking advantage of that opportunity. No Jew should ever suffer from self-esteem. Well, I wasn't really the high achiever in class. I don't have the IQ of other people. God, the person has dyslexia. Doesn't make a difference. Every person has his purpose in existence. And you got to work within the parameters of what you're given. Average IQ, superior IQ, limited material, unlimited material, whatever it is. If you have a proper belief, I'm meant to succeed within the parameters of my challenges. If you have that in mind, you're intimidated by no one. You're confident, you're secure. You just have to meet the criteria to be able to succeed within those parameters. No self-esteem issues. But I don't have what the other person has. I'm not as good looking as the other person. I'm not as well connected. My family is below the radar. They don't even know I exist. Doesn't make a difference, but God knows you exist. and you know who you are in terms of as a Jew. You're God's child. Rabbi Akiva, who was the greatest of the 10 martyrs, which the Talmud tells us, could you imagine? The Romans were such barbarians. They scathed the flesh off his body and they sold it in the meat market in Rome. This is how they put him to death. And as they were torturing him to death, his students were there. It was done in the presence of his students. It was a public display. And his students are crying and wailing, seeing their Rebbe, the teacher, being tortured to death. And he looks at them and he says to them, why are you crying? Don't you realize this moment is the greatest moment of my life? My whole life, I've waited for this moment. And we're not talking a person who needed medication because of the way he spoke. He says, we say in the Shema, you should love God with all your heart and with all your soul. That even if it's a question of them taking your soul, although it may be the most torturous moment of your life and the most painful, but if I could display my love for God at that most painful moment, it's the greatest achievement of my life. That's what Rebbe Akiva said to his students. This is the greatest moment because I'm displaying my love for God at this most unusual moment. They were scathing the flesh off his body. So I always ask the question. They were crying. Rebbe Akiva was in the state of ecstasy. Why were they crying? Why was he in the state of ecstasy? They also knew. They knew the verse, it says, you should love God with all your life, even if they take your life. You have to give your life for God to display that love. The difference is, Rebbe Akiva was the greatest Torah sage of his generation. To go and display and depict how great his genius was, says he was able to uproot mountains and grind them together. That was the degree, the profundity of his genius. One moment of Rebbe Akiva's Torah had greater value than a whole generation's Torah. And God says, you should give that all up to display your love for me, even to give your life. And Rebbe Akiva understood that. So what is the value of giving your life, especially when you know what your life is worth? The more you're worth, spiritually speaking, the greater you appreciate the value of giving that up. But what did the students see? If our Rebbe is not here, we're going to be denied all that Torah at that special level. They were looking at their loss. It may be Rebbe Akiva's gain, which is the ultimate gain, but where does it leave us? It leaves us in the dust. We read in Pirkei Avos, it says you should roll in the dust of the Chachamim, the dust of the feet. But you have to have the rabbi there to roll in his dust. But if the rabbi is no longer here, what dust are we rolling in? Therefore, they cried. But what did Rebbe Akiva understand? If we say every mitzvah we do, schar b'hayal maleko, the innate value of mitzvah is so infinitely valuable, God can't reward you even for one mitzvah in this life. And you have another 30 years to live. And now you're confronted with a situation where you must give your life to sanctify his name. So 30 years of living, and every moment I'm able to perform a mitzvah which has infinite value, where for one mitzvah, this world is not sufficient to pay that person, to reward that person. And you're willing to give that all up for God's glory. What does that say? It's a display of love, selfless love. It's not me, it's him. But if you do that, for him, it has greater value than whatever you do for yourself. Because God's child was taken, or God's child gave his life for the glory of his Father, for the glory of his King. So it's important to know who we are and what we are, and to what degree God values us. A person goes to battle, and you don't have the weaponry to fight the battle. You don't stand the chance to survive that battle. Impossible. But what about a person understands he has a weaponry which nothing could stand up against the weaponry which he has? He enters into that battle with confidence because he knows if he uses that weaponry, especially if he was trained how to use it, he will definitely be the victor. He will vanquish his enemy. Now let's understand something. What is part of our cachet of weapons? The most sophisticated weapons. You know, we speak of Star Wars weapons. What is it? There's a Balaturim. When Moshe came to the Jewish people in the name of God to share with them the 4 expressions of redemption, God says to Moshe, Lochein emor lohem, therefore tell them. And that's when we drink the 4 cups at the Seder, 4 cups of wine to correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption. So the Balaturim says the numerical value of Lochein is 100. Lamed is 30, Chof is 20, and Nun is 50. Lochein emor lohem. What does that mean? Avram Avinu, when was Yitzchak born? He was 100 years old. So who do you have behind you? You have the merit of Avram. That's Lochein, that's 100. We read about Yitzchak, the second patriarch. Canaan was struck with a famine, and he was going to leave Canaan to go to Egypt. God says, do not leave the land. It was a famine year, and he stayed in that area, the Philistine territory, which was part of Canaan. And it says, despite that it was a famine year, he planted his crop, and the return, the yield on the crop was 100 times a normal yield. 100. Again, that's Lochein, numerical value 100. You have the merit of Yitzchak behind you. That's part of your toolbox. That's part of your cachet of weapons. Avram 100, Yitzchak 100. Yaakov being the most special of all the patriarchs. He fathered the 12 tribes. By the time he was 100 years old, he had all of his 12 sons were born to him. So Lochein means the reason why you can merit these 4 levels of redemption, which there's nothing you can't contend with. There's nothing which can oppose you, is Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's our clout. That's our power. Our power is we were backed by the merit of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And that's why we were taken to be God's children, and that's why we're royalty. For that reason. Understanding that you have royal blood in your veins, and you have a connection which no one has that connection. But what does it say? When Moshe told them this, it fell on deaf ears. Lo shamu Moshe bikotzu rachavoda kosher, because they were overwhelmed with the workload and the demand. If they wouldn't deliver, they did not heed Moshe, they could not listen to Moshe because they were short-winded and because of the overwhelming level of heavy work. Therefore, they couldn't appreciate. They knew it, but they couldn't internalize it. But if you could internalize it, you could stand up against the world without a problem. Because you have Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as your backers, or I should say, because you are an outgrowth of who they were, therefore God is your backer. Knowing this in advance and reflecting on it, besides everything else, you enter with a level of confidence into that audience. You live your life as a person who is not intimidated by anything, by any situation, because you have that internal understanding of God will take care of you. That's what we call faith and trust in God. And you become a walking Kiddush Hashem. You play up to no one. You don't compromise your values for anyone. Your level of integrity will never be compromised for any reason. People do a lot of things for a lot of reasons, but it's all as a result of that inadequacies or the lack of confidence or the lack of whatever it is, and they're willing to compromise on many things for the goal end. A Jew doesn't have to compromise. If we are who we are and we know who we are, God will not abandon us. And this is what Moshe says to the Jews continuously. And if you understand that, you will always walk with your head high, not as an arrogance, but with confidence, because you are who you are. Other people may process it as arrogance, but it's not. A person has 300 IQ, and there's no question he can't answer. And people say to him, "Oh, could you answer this question?" He says, "Yes, I could." That seems to be pretty arrogant. But you don't understand, my IQ is 3 times your IQ. That's my reality. It's not arrogance, it's just reality. I have a different reality than you are. I'm not boasting. You asked me a question, I'm responding to your question. Same idea. There's no reason why a Jew should feel he's second class, third class, no matter what, even if you're discriminated against. Because discrimination against a Jew is part of God's plan. That's part of our challenge. Despite that, we still are who we are.